So thank you all for being able to participate this afternoon. Welcome to the CAC Transit Element Subcommittee meeting. Today what we want to do is review the long-range regional transit plan recommendations, and our team, which is Rio de Leon and Preston McLaughlin, we are, all three of us, going to tag team this presentation for you. What we want to show you are the recommendations of the long-range transit plan and how they relate to the sub-elements that you will hopefully be reviewing and approving today so that you can move it forward to the full CAC. So again, my name is Paki Rico. I'm the Community Affairs Administrator. I've got Rio de Leon with me, Interim Transportation and Mobility Manager, and Preston McLaughlin, Planning Coordinator. The three of us are together in the room today to join you all remotely. So thank you again for your participation.
Paki, do you see the slide control arrows in the bottom left corner of the screen? You'll have to use the mouse.
I'll do it.
Okay.
If you want to.
We will do that right now. Oh, there they are.
Next slide when you're ready to go.
Go ahead. Okay. So just to give you an idea, hopefully you've all had an opportunity to at least take a glance at the long-range regional transit plan. We've sent you the link several times, and we also included it in the agenda of today's meeting. What we want to do is just highlight some of the transit plan, main things so that you can start relating them to our exercise today of applying them to the categorical sub-elements. So we're going to refer to it as the LRRTP, so the Long Range Regional Transit Plan, LRRTP. The reason it was developed was to guide informed decisions about using public transportation and how the public could get around. The plan focuses on a frequency-first approach, and this is consistent with PAG's future transit vision efforts and builds on existing frequent transit network. There's also a choices report that provides an overview of the existing regional transit system and describes choices and efficiency. If any of you need any of these reports or need to know where to find them, please let us know afterward and we can certainly send you that information. The important thing to note here is that the LRRTP was adopted unanimously by our PAG Regional Council. And the subcommittee, this CAC Transit Element Subcommittee, did review and recommend the transit sub-element distribution based on the LRRTP. So one of the key components of the LRRTP is the public involvement process. It was really critical to the development of this process. There was input from regional workshops and open houses which provided valuable direction that are integrated in the plan. If you need additional information on that, it's all in the plan that you received. And then PAG, in conjunction with all of our member jurisdictions and a consultant by the name of Jarrett Walker and Associates, they undertook an intensive design workshop to develop the core recommendations of the plan. It was very intensive and really provided a lot of critical information. So again, we hope that you take the time to review all of that. So the things that we want to focus on today are the service strategies that are in the plan. What we did is we took the 4 service strategies and are relating them to how they are consistent with the sub-elements. And these are the 4 recommendations in the plan. So the first service strategy is the consistent service 7 days a week. The second one is to improve evening service. The third one is to expand the frequent transit network. And then the fourth one is targeted expansions in the suburbs. So the first service strategy, which is consistent service 7 days a week, the plan focuses on, the plan is divided on why each of these matters and then the long-term and short-term effects of it. So why weekend service matters, according to the plan, more jobs are on non-traditional schedules that require occasional or regular weekend shifts. So this includes people who work in retail, healthcare, restaurants, personal service, those kinds of things. Improving the weekend service helps to improve the lives of people with lower income is what the plan surmised. These sectors also drive significant and growing numbers of weekend trips for shopping, socializing, recreation, and other purposes. And then people may be reluctant to use transit because of its inconsistent availability. But if you need to drive to get to a weekend shift, you're less likely to use transit on a weekday, even at a time when the bus comes every 15 minutes, is again, one of the things that came out of the plan. So continuing on this service strategy, for existing weekend service, SunTran routes have lower levels of service on weekends than on weekdays, particularly on Sundays when most of the routes operate only once an hour. So the plan is divided into two phases. The first phase for this strategy is weekend improvements. And again, based on the public feedback that was received, improvements to weekend service are a high priority, especially for people with more urgent transit needs, as was described in the previous slide. So the plan's proposal is to improve weekend service for phase one of this plan. And then within 2 years of funding, all of the SunTran routes would run at the same frequencies on weekends as they would on weekdays. Continuing on this service strategy for phase two, the frequent transit network, or the FTN, as that expands, so does the weekend service. So within 5 years, all of the new FTN routes would have frequent service on weekends as well as weekdays. For long-term and evening improvements, the frequent transit network expansion would continue, but it would be within 10 to 20 years, frequent service would become available 7 days a week within a half mile of 46% of the region's residents and 85% of Tucson residents. So those were the plan proposals. So this is just a snapshot of the transit element adopted allocation that this subcommittee discussed previously. So for weekend bus service, the current funding allocation through 2026 is $24.2 million. The adopted allocation is $51 million. So at this point, I just wanted to pause a minute about weekend bus service to see if there are any questions and to see if you wanted to have some sort of agreement on this allocation or continue to go through the rest of them and do it that way. I see Amanda Parkman's hand is up. Amanda?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if my question is relevant now or later, so please feel free to push it to later. But I actually have two questions. My first thing is, I love seeing that we want to expand weekend hours as a transit user because that's the time when I really need it too. But I'm wondering, maybe this was covered in the last meeting and I missed it, but I don't recall seeing it. Where would this money be coming from to be able to do that? And then my other question, which may not be relevant right now, is I'm wondering where the comprehensive operational analysis that SunTran is doing right now, where does this come into play with what we are going over with these different elements?
Sure, Amanda. I've got Rio and Preston in the room. Can you address the first question?
I can speak to the COA process,
Okay.
and you know, at any given point, our members from the Transit Working Group can also chime in here. The COA, in terms of how it relates to this particular piece is a very small component. We're looking at operational efficiencies gained in the COA and not really looking at how to fund future service expansions on weekends. So I hope that answers your question. The COA really deals with, you know, our very pressing needs in terms of operational efficiencies, which is kind of rooted in the present versus funding for the future.
And then in terms of, I guess your first question was where these funds are being pulled from. They come from the $510 million that was approved by the RTA board recently, and they're, you know, the adopted allocation at this current time at $51 million, that, you know, was the amount that was approved by the Transit Subcommittee in 2020, if I'm understanding it correctly. But those numbers can change, and that's what this meeting, you know, is wanting to do as an action, is to, you know, make sure that everyone feels comfortable with the adopted amount or the allocated amount that was approved by the subcommittee in 2020, and if not, you know, to work within those parameters of the $510 million for the, you know, for all transit sub elements. And so it's my understanding that based on this long-range regional transportation plan, the subcommittee felt that increasing the funds for weekend bus services by almost double would, you know, compared to the current RTA plan, would be sufficient. But again, that is up for debate today.
Amanda, did that answer your question? And again, the adopted allocation you see here is what the RTA board has approved for this particular element. The current funding allocation is what we had in the current RTA through 2026.
It does. I think I'm tracking. I think I'm getting it. I do have another question, but I don't want to take up more space, so I'll wait since I asked my questions. And yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Next, I've got Carolyn.
Yes, you just asked if we thought we should stop at each sub-element, and my preference would be to go through the whole thing and talk about questions and comments. Thanks.
Thanks for that feedback, Carolyn. I'll go ahead and take this round of questions just because I asked, and then we'll continue to go through. But this is an example of what we're going to do for each of the service strategies and sub-elements. Tom.
Well, that's okay. I'll defer. I just wanted to know what the that the committee at the time believed, and that the jurisdictions believed that 51 million would accomplish the things that you laid out as the goals for improved weekend service.
Thank you, Tom. Arlen?
Yeah, so good afternoon. I realize these happened in 2020, and I clearly missed whatever meeting covered this, because it's all that's why I'm a little bit behind the 8 ball. But having said that, if I'm looking at the long-range transportation plan, and I see for service strategy number 1, consistent service 7 days a week, on page 26 and 27 of what we were mailed, I see phase 1, weekend improvements, phase 2, weekend improvements, and then long-term weekend improvements. So is my interpretation that the $51 million that's adopted as an allocation here, does that get you to fully fund phase 1 weekend improvements, or fully fund phase 2 weekend improvements, or beyond? I'm assuming it's phase 1.
Great question, Arlen. Do you guys know if that's phase 1 or phase 2?
Well, I guess there is some additional information regarding costs broken up into the different phases. It's on page 11 through 18, I believe. These are the costs and benefits both for the medium term and the long term. And this is broken up by service costs and capital costs. And it doesn't necessarily go into the specifics of, each of the, what do you call them?
The service strategies.
The service strategies, yeah, thank you. But it does show you, between years 1 and 2, service, the calculated service costs will be this million. For years 3 through 5, service costs will be this, this many million. So it's a little less granular, but that might help in giving you an idea of, where the numbers were pulled. And then I think in terms of I wasn't here in 2020 when these sub-element allocations were initially approved by this subcommittee. But there is $510 million that was approved by the RTA board for, all transit sub-elements for RTA Next. And that may not align exactly with, the costs that are included in this report. it should be close, but unfortunately I don't have the historical knowledge to provide that information.
If I may follow up, Arlen,
Sure.
I think what we're just trying to show you that these sub-elements are in line with the long-range regional transit plan and their proposals. I see Farhad on there. Farhad, do you want to add some information to that?
Yeah, just to add on to what Paki and Preston said. So, Arlen, the goal was at the time to have a menu of options and a range of costs. So as Preston mentioned in the document, they talked about early phases, midterm phases, and long-term phases. So the menu of those expenditures obviously has to be decided over time. The intent was to get the ball rolling, and we've already done that with the first RTA. So a lot of the capital expenses and potential replacement costs, those are the kind of things we have to determine over time. But as you can see, current 20-year plan, $24 million. So just in terms of putting it in context, we're talking about doubling that investment, continuing with replacement cost and operation costs. So it is really more of a relative expense. And if you look at those pages that Preston mentioned, it kind of gives you that range of what do you get for $51 million.
Yeah, appreciate that. I'm struggling with to point to something. The document we have to look at is this long-term transportation plan for transit, and I get that. And to say how that money, that adopted allocation relates to, somehow I think we have to do a really good job if we're going to sell this to voters as well as to ourselves, of saying in this plan it says do this and do that and whatever. It's like I'm struggling to say where in the plan, when it looks to the future, that phase 1, phase 2, and such, are we, and then where will we be if we spend this adopted allocation at a point? And I think we need to be able to answer that question fairly succinctly and with some accuracy, so that you can point to something and because it sounds like, and I don't mean to cast aspersions, but it sounds like it's like, well, trust us, this makes it better. I'm sure it makes it better because it's more money, but I don't know if it's actually in line with where the goals or the trigger of the what do you call the phase points are in this in the transportation plan for transit. And that's where I'm struggling. I think we need to pinpoint this better, is what I'm saying. So I understand it's tough. It's a tough thing to do.
You're actually describing the next step in the process. So once we determine the level of investment, then we can come back and add that additional description of what $51 million will buy within that category. So that is the next step in the process. It's a chicken and egg thing, right? So for now, you have the long range plan that gives you the range. And then once we pick that number, then we can come back and add that additional definition, description of what that would buy in the next 20 years. And we'll get there. That's part of the process. But I know it's kind of, it might appear to be a reverse, but we got to start from somewhere. So if you start with the investment level, then you can define what that buys you.
Thank you. I also wanted to mention that we have, as you know, we have invited regional transportation working group members and transit operators that are also participating in this meeting. And I do see Mr. Steve Spade's hand up if you wanted to add to the conversation, Steve.
Yeah, thank Pocky. Yeah, this is Steve Spade. I'm on the transit working group and with Suntran. And I kind of agree with Carolyn's comments that maybe we ought to save things for the end, but since I had my hand up, I thought I'll share this comment now that is probably going to relate to all of them because it is a little more general comment. And respectfully, I have to add that I don't know that I completely agree with Rio's summary of what the COA is. We're doing so we develop in our communities a long-range transportation plan and then a long-range transit plan. And those set, 20 years goals for the system. We then develop a series of short-range transit improvement programs. And what those short-range plans do is they help us focus on the detail that Farhad was just talking about. That, so you get questions about night weekend service and night service. Well, when we do this comprehensive operations analysis, we're doing two things. We're looking at how our resources are currently being spent. So what are we doing that's working well? What are we doing that's not working so well? And then there's a really significant public input portion to the COA. And in that portion, we start to get feedback from the public on what their needs are. And I'll point out that we're in a post-pandemic era. What we're hearing in public feedback today is different than what we were hearing pre-pandemic. So there's a lot of really valid information that's shared. And you take that public need and you start to take a look at where your resources are being allocated and then talk about how do we allocate them in a more efficient way that also starts to meet the needs of the public. So some of the information that we're producing in the COA is not just efficiencies, but it helps really fine tune and understand what is more important to people today, have things changed, and then we ought to be able to take that information that we're in the process of kind of refining right now and be able to help you make sure that your allocation processes make sense, or do we need to build some kind of flexibility into this to respond? And somebody had a question about, I want to be able to focus on doing this and doing that. In the COA, as we work through the COA, we have the specifics that can be considered. If we need to extend evening service, how late, where, what areas of the city benefit more from it than others, and what kind of needs do we have? So we can focus on specific kinds of projects that you can now explain to the public that are going to benefit them. And like I said, I think I could do this after probably every element, so I may just save it until the end again.
Thank you for those comments, Steve. And I think what we'll do is, I know I see a couple more hands up. Let's go ahead and move forward, and hopefully some of these questions will apply to the following sub-elements. So we'll go ahead and move forward to, so that was weekend bus service. The next service strategy is to improve evening service. And again, the plan talks about why evening service matters, and it's very similar to the weekend service. that it's been much lower than daytime service, and there's an assumption that most trips occur between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. And then the plan that talks about that there are still very good reasons to question why evening service levels after 7 p.m. are low. Continuing on this service strategy and reasons for improving evening service include, again, the same as weekend, non-traditional schedules, especially lower wage jobs in service, retail, healthcare, et cetera. As you know, those often involve shifts that start in the midday and later than 6 p.m. So access to transit in the evening helps to improve the lives of people that work in these jobs. People who are not working make many evening trips for shopping, socializing, recreation, other purposes as well. And then many people are reluctant to use transit because of its inconsistent availability. So if you need to drive to get to an evening shift or a once a week evening social activity, then you're less likely to use transit on a different day and time. So for existing evening service levels, most SunTran routes operate only once an hour after 7 p.m. Only a few streets on the frequent transit network get service every 30 minutes. And then most, but not all, routes operate until midnight on weekdays. Evening service ends around 10 p.m. on Saturdays and 9 p.m. on Sundays. For the phase 1 of the evening improvements, again, this is all based on public feedback. Improvements to evening service are also a high priority, especially for people with more urgent transit needs. So the proposal that the plan lays out is to improve the weekend service in phase 1 of this plan. And then within 2 years of funding, all of the FTN routes would operate every 30 minutes in the evening. And all SunTran routes would operate until midnight, 7 days a week. For phase 2 improvements, as the FTN expands, so would the evening service. And then within 5 years, all of the existing and new FTN routes would provide service every 30 minutes after 7 p.m. Similar to phase 1, all of the SunTran routes would continue to operate until midnight, 7 days a week. And then looking at long-term evening improvements, within 10 to 20 years, all of the SunTran routes would operate every 30 minutes or better in the evenings, 7 days a week, from 7 p.m. until midnight. And then the busiest FTN routes and the examples that were used in the plans were streets such as Broadway, Speedway, Oracle, and South 6th. They would retain service every 15 minutes or better until midnight. So again, just a snapshot of the RTA Next transit element. Weekday evening bus service, current funding allocation is at $43.1 million, and then the adopted allocation by the subcommittee is looking at $76.5 million. Moving forward to service strategy number 3, this is the expansion of the frequent transit network. Again, why frequency matters is that waiting time is often a dominant part of travel time. Frequency is one of the most critical features of a successful transit line. The more often the bus comes by, according to the plan, the less you need to keep track of the schedule, the more you can travel whenever and wherever you want, and the further you can go in the same amount of time. Frequency service provides more freedom, and it's useful for many more types of trips than a bus that only comes every 30 minutes or every hour. Recognizing this, the City of Tucson and the RTA invested in the frequent transit network, a set of routes with service every 15 minutes from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. on on weekdays. And then based on public feedback, expanding the frequent service is also a high priority for Tucsonans. The existing frequent service also includes 11 SunTran routes and the Sunlink streetcar. Some of these routes are on streets that have traditionally generated the most ridership. Examples are Broadway, Speedway, Oracle, and South 6th. Others are more recent additions that expanded frequent service to large parts of the east side. Despite the expansions, many areas still have relatively high densities of people and jobs that remain beyond the frequent transit network. And this includes most of the south side as well as parts of the outer east side and the inner northwest side. For medium-term FTN improvements, expansion would require significant restructuring of the existing service, especially on the south side. This type of effort requires significant advanced planning and public outreach. It would not be possible, according to the plan, to operate the expanded FTN without purchasing more buses. And that takes about 2 years from the time that a new bus is ordered. The first major FTN expansion is proposed in phase 2 of this plan, while phase 1 focuses on evening and weekend service. So again, continuing with medium-term FTN improvements, within 5 years, the frequent network would expand to cover most of the south side and Flowing Wells Road. This expansion would be targeted at reaching the largest swaths of highly populated neighborhoods that are not on the FTN today, and they would reach much higher numbers of people with low incomes and limited access to cars. For the long-term FTN improvements, within 10 to 20 years, anyone in the core areas of Tucson metropolitan area would be able to reach frequent service in any direction within a 10-minute walk. Frequent routes would be spaced on a consistent 1-by-1 mile grid in most of Tucson, and it would also extend to all parts of the region that are developed in a relatively dense, linear, and continuous fashion. This includes frequent routes on the south side, as well as in the Flowing Wells area, on the outer east side, and in the Casas Adobes area. So snapshot of this RTA Next Transit element. For bus frequency, the current funding allocation is $79.6 million, and the adopted allocation that the subcommittee approved was $86.7 million. The fourth and final service strategy from the long-range plan is targeted expansions in the suburbs. Why expand suburban service? The plan dedicates the majority of service expansions to core areas of the region. Investments in additional service are most likely to make transit convenient to large numbers of people, generate significant new ridership, and make efficient use of the public funds. The plan considered all parts of the greater Tucson region and recommends service expansions in certain suburban areas. These are expected demand for transit service is likely to grow over the next 20 years. These areas may, in very long term, become more similar to the core of the region. The local demographics also suggest extremely high levels of need for service. This is due to age, income, and car ownership levels, for example. And a high proportion of people living in these areas need public transportation service. Even if we do not expect that service to ever generate high ridership or even ridership comparable to existing core services. The public feedback on the draft plan suggested that suburban residents tend to place a much higher value on improvements to suburban service than on urban residents. Nearly 40% of the suburban respondents to the online and in-person survey that was done in September of 2019 indicated that the initially proposed medium-term service improvements were not enough. For this reason, several improvements originally intended for the long term, which was meant for the 10 to 20 years, were now placed in phase 2, which is now in the 5 years of plan funding. For medium-term suburban improvements, the proposed improvements to suburban service are in the first 5 years of the plan, and then for long-term within 10 to 20 years of the beginning of the plan. And then snapshot of the RTA Next Transit element that includes this R3. There's the neighborhood circulator bus systems, which was adopted at 76.5. The current allocation is 45.8 million. The express service, which is adopted at 25.5 million, and it was slightly higher at 26.7 million for the current funding allocations. And then the service area expansion, the adopted allocation is 35.7 million. The current funding allocation through 2026 is 31.7 million. So that concludes the just the brief overview of the long-range transit plan as it relates to the RTA next sub-elements. In our next agenda item, this is where, the discussion will begin on the allocation. But I just wanted to stop here in case there were any questions that are related to the long-range transit plan before we move forward to focusing on the transit sub-elements. I see Arlen's hand up and Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you. To that last point that you talked about, maybe I'm missing something, but it said the public, and it was the survey of 2019, the public was demanding more services for suburban areas, but and they ultimately moved the priority for some of that up to the next level rather than a further out phase, if I got that correctly, and a closer in phase from a further phase. But that then showed that the amount of money that was, well, there's two questions. One is it showed that the amount of money was either roughly stable or declining from what it was in the original allocation to the proposed future allocation. And then I'm also wondering, it goes back to the survey, folks in suburban areas, if the densities are high enough where those folks are living, it makes sense. If folks in suburban areas who are in very low density want transit services, it doesn't make any sense. And I'm wondering if the nature of that survey or who responded to that survey made a difference in making flat or slightly reducing the allocation.
So I'll try to answer that. So it really depends on which type of service we're looking at. That's why you had three different categories.
Right.
Some of the circulators can accommodate some of those less dense areas. The express service can accommodate some of those far out and maybe more dense areas. And then the service area expansions, again, like you said, depends on the studies that have to be conducted, decisions that have to be made over time to determine which routes are going to be more efficient and potentially could expand fixed routes. And so that's why you got three different categories spread out over three categories. Again, going through the exercise when we were doing this, at least the feeling was that if there were opportunities for people to use transit, they would in the areas that transit currently does not exist. So that's kind of how the phrasing is in the document, that if you expand in these areas, you are potentially going to increase ridership.
Thank you, Farhad. I hope that helped your question, Arlen.
Well, can I just ask a follow-up? If you could go back to that last slide that you had with the three different numbers on that one. Thank you. So what we're saying, if I understand correctly, is that increased demand is going to be primarily handled through neighborhood circulator bus systems and less on the express service and only slightly more in service area expansion based on these numbers.
Yeah, roughly. Again, so neighborhood circulators ideally would be designed in a way that they would connect you to park and ride facilities, connect you to the express services. So that's why there was a little bit more emphasis on those circulators.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Carolyn, I know I mentioned you, but I forgot that Mel's hand was up from the previous discussion. So if you don't mind, I'm going to jump to Mel really quick. Mel?
Yeah, anybody else that had their hands up too, that's fine. I'll wait. Thanks.
Thanks, Mel.
I would like some raw numbers. So what each of our categories, how well we're doing now, and what we think will be the improved numbers by these funding mechanisms, plans. And to give some context, I need to understand what we think is doing well, because I think we need to convince the community that what we're going to do is going to do better. And then where has the strategy that we're using, which is essentially based on access, where has this worked? So we can look in other communities and say, yeah, when they increase the frequency, the weekends, here's what you can expect. And so within that, I'd really like to know, what numbers we expect to improve over the weekend and evening, and are there alternatives so that we can look at what's being produced and say, yeah, this is working well.
So I'll touch on it, and I might call on Steve to hopefully piggyback. As he mentioned, the COA is really the exercise to accommodate that opportunity for us to analyze the success and efficiency of those projects that have been implemented. So the last document was roughly about 10 years ago. So we're now doing another one. So that's really the best opportunity to take a look at which routes are successful, which routes are potentially in need of some adjustments. But our transit providers, all of our partners, they do that on a regular basis. And so I'll call on Steve, but I'm sure other partners can chime in. That's basically what they do on an annual basis. They take a look at the routes, take a look at how efficient they are, take a look at where potentially adjustment can be made. And so that's a dynamic effort. So Steve, if you don't mind, anything else you want to add to that?
Sure, Farhad, I'm happy to jump in. And Farhad's exactly right. What we focus on an annual basis, and then also in the COA, is saying, what services are we providing that are doing well, what aren't, and what portions of we break our services down to segments of routes, times a day, so we can really drill down and tell you where we have the greatest demand and the greatest usage, and then where there's less of it. And so that really helps us make decisions about, if I'm providing service in an area that isn't performing very well, I may be able to redesign that service to meet another need, or I may be able to, come up with something else. And a good example is we streamlined some fixed route buses on the south side because they to improve their performance in terms of the number of buses, but then introduced neighborhood circulators in an urban setting. Understanding that there are people living in an urban setting that have mobility needs, and their desires are to take shorter trips. We were actually able to operate that combination of services more cost effectively than we did the one route. And in addition to operating more cost effectively, our ridership actually grew both on the fixed route and on the on-demand service. So we're able to do those kinds of things. And one of the things I wanted to say about the neighborhood circulators is that while there's a suburban need to feed express routes and provide mobility in suburban communities, we've also shown through our on-demand pilot, there's a real need to expand neighborhood circulators in the urban area. So you get into these more dense areas where you got a higher degree of maybe transit dependency, elderly population that really depend on the service. They're making short trips. So there's a real benefit to being able to take a look at that strategy in an urban setting too.
So I will ask, what do you think is working well now that we can say to the public, you can have confidence, this is almost doubling taxpayers' money, that it's going to work well?
Well, I mean, I have all kinds of editorial opinions, but in probably 30 days, we'll have a lot of more detail on exactly how the routes are performing and what the public is telling us as we're trying to go through the public comments, because we have to match both of those up. So I'm not, I mean, I think that question is really well answered if, some of our team were able to give you an update kind of on where we are on gathering the data as part of that comprehensive operations analysis.
Okay, so what I would expect answers to that with raw numbers, so we understand how much we're investing to have an increase and what that return will be, and where this strategy has worked elsewhere. I have a bunch of other questions, but I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Let's hear from Diane. Diane Shiflett.
Okay, I think I've unmuted myself successfully. Hi, this is Diane. I don't know if this is germane to this discussion, but I just want to let it be known, anytime we can improve transit, I think that's a great thing. And I'm wondering if we're concerned that the public won't be behind it. It seems like when we talk about these improvements, we're trying to convince that this is why we need to do it. I'm all in personally, but of course I'm just one. But my question then is, for the long-term plan, and right now we're kind of doing this amazing experiment with free transit, how will that factor in? And is that even a possibility to keep it free? Because I know, well, maybe Steve can answer this about how much of the percentage of the cost of maintenance and running it is coming from the fare box. So I'm just curious if we can talk about that. Thanks.
Maybe I'll start, and then Steve, again, if you like, you can chime in. So two things. I want to make sure we're all clear on RTA's mission. RTA's mission is to enhance existing services. So I think going back to your original question, enhancement is always good. Obviously, going back to Mel's question, we want to enhance where we think we're going to get the most efficient and return on the investment. And I think we can answer all those questions. We can go down the list and identify where we believe the best use of those enhancements are. And then the second part is, again, RTA's mission, this is by design, is to enhance. So the basic services that are currently being provided by the transit agencies, we hope that they will continue to provide those basic services with the resources that they have. So we got to make sure that we keep those two separate buckets, enhancements versus maintaining what we currently do. So Steve, if you want to jump in, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think I concur. Our focus, whether we're charging fares or we're not, is to make sure that we're understanding where we need to operate the service and providing the service that meets the need of the public. There may be some nuances in in the kind of service you're providing, but at the end of the day, we as transit providers are given resources to operate service, and it's our public responsibility to make sure that we're spending those resources to operate the services in the most cost-effective manner. So whether we're charging fares or not, we really have the same focus, and that's providing good, safe, high-quality service that meets the needs of the public.
Thank you. I've got Carolyn and Tom.
Tom, I think Tom had his hand up before too, so I will defer to him.
Okay, a couple of just kind of quick questions with probably not quick answers, but I'll try anyway. The last three sub-elements, which are the neighborhood circulators, the express service, and the special needs or disabled service, don't seem to be front and center in the long range plan for some reason. And although there is some discussion about them, I don't see them as major strategies for expansion or treatment. And I just wonder why that is. And then kind of piggybacking on what Mel was talking about, looking for metrics for these things is going to be important. I think, once you start talking to the public, they want to say, well, what do I get for that investment? What should I expect, or what can you promise me about increased ridership and or reduced congestion, et cetera? And your section 4 of the long range plan kind of gets into discussions about that. And then finally at the end, why invest? And I think those would probably be helpful for us to know a little bit more about. So
I'll jump in again. So yes, good comments, and that is our intent, to be able to tell the public, in addition to obviously all the decision makers in the process, that going through this exercise, hopefully there is consensus, and hopefully there is a story to be told that these would be beneficial investments. So that's again, next step in the process. We have to get there once we decide on these levels. And then going back to the ADA services that you mentioned. So we did have obviously a lot of discussions around some of the things that we are required to do. Obviously, we will continue to do everything that we are required to do. And some of those elements obviously were that if you do, so for example, if we do expand into a new service area, obviously we have to provide that complementary required benefit as well. So they didn't get into that as much, but you're right. It is a component of any decision we make to continue to provide that service and enhance that service. And I don't recall if we had that table in front of us yet, but you can see the amount of investment to enhance those services reflect the need as well.
Yeah, they're fairly modest improvements in like express and service area expansion that are shown here, and probably from what the original allocation was, they're probably level or even less. But obviously, a lot was packed into the neighborhood circulators to fix some of that expansion area service.
Yeah, so with the express service, early on there was significant amount of capital investments up front, so that's been somewhat stabilized. But we do have replacement costs, obviously, if we continue that. I recall, as part of the conversation with this group, and we hear it all the time, that there's this I think perception that express service is potentially not as efficient as it could be. So that was one of the reasons I believe that the group believed to keep it at the same level and not invest more. At least that was what I remember about the conversation. But personally, and I think the COA will demonstrate that at least the routes that we currently have hopefully are starting to get back to pre-pandemic levels, and hopefully will continue to promote the use of the express service so we can get more efficiency out of them.
I guess I wanted to jump in a little bit to maybe try and provide a little bit more input on some of the previous questions about raw data. I will say within the long range plan, there are some helpful graphs. I'm looking at one right now on page 15. They're peppered throughout the plan. but this actually shows, these graphs indicate how many people, who live in the area would receive, increased service based on, it shows you, the baseline existing services, and then it has medium-term and long-term services as well. And so you can see in these graphs, if you're wanting additional quantitative data, there are percentages that, were calculated by the Jared Walker when they created this report that shows, if you make the changes that we recommend, this is the percent increase in how many people will benefit from those changes. And if you connect these graphs with the cost and benefit section, which I mentioned previously, pages 11 through 18, which show you, service costs for phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, that gives you, essentially how much it's going to cost to, create those changes. So with that cost information and with the percent increase in accessibility to residences and jobs from these graphs, you can get a better idea of, if you, make these changes, which is this amount of money, this is, the percentage increase in, at least in, potential riders. And so for this type of report, which is a regional report, it's very high level. It's very difficult to accurately predict. We can say, there are this many people who are now able to take the service, but unless you do more localized studies, you can't really determine how many of those people who have access are actually going to utilize it. Mm-hmm. And so that's just a number that I feel is not, for this type of, for a regional analysis, it's pretty improbable to accurately determine that. That's where, what Steve mentioned is what they do is, whenever they notice that some routes, specific routes, are low on ridership or not performing where they need to perform, that's where they do that more localized research, data analysis for that route specifically, for that region, whatever. And that's where you can get that more granular data of like, if we make these changes based on, public input and that type of thing, this is how many people we believe will, actually utilize the service. So I just wanted to throw that in there as well. It's a good resource to reference if you can just, look at the estimated cost with the estimated percent increases, and that can give you an idea. And it's broken up by, the weekday service, evening service, and weekend service. And so, yeah, I just recommend, looking at the numbers in terms of the costs, and then the, percentage increases based on, which medium-term, long-term phases you're interested in. And then that can kind of help guide your decision on, at least based on this report, where those you can see those impacts and those improvements and those enhancements.
Thanks, Preston. Steve, did you need to add to that?
Well, I think the only thing I'd add, and Preston is right, that's a kind of a 10,000 foot analysis, of where you are. When we start to do service planning, then we're able to do a deeper dive. As we design service, we look at more specifically at population density, traffic generators. We match up demographics with the traffic generators, so we can do a better job of projecting, what service might be more successful in what areas based on a number of those factors. And again, that's what we do in the COA. We really try to drill down so that you get better information as we're doing the planning.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, we have a few more questions, and then we'll move to the next part of the presentation, which will be, just really looking at these allocations and hopefully blessing them today. So Carolyn.
Okay, thank you. I just had a couple questions, but after this last discussion, I've got a few more comments. But I understand the 10,000 foot level, and the big question, are they really going to use it? But as Pocky said at the beginning, this was based, the long range transit plan was based on a lot of public input, and that's what they'd like to depend on, that people were actually telling the truth. And yes, there can be changes within that system yearly or however often they do the Suntran does their analysis, but I think that's what we're asking to do. It kind of goes to Mel's question earlier, or actually our last meeting, saying, you know, where's the data? How do we know that people are going to use it? We just don't. And we are asked to make, you know, these allocations. But I guess a big question I have, and this, I guess, goes to Suntran or maybe the city, but when we're talking about all these, the allocations that we'd like to see versus the current level of service, how much of this, each of these budget numbers is current service, and how much of it are those improvements that Pocky was laying out? Because we're not talking about, like Mel said, all sorts of new service. Most of this, as I think that Farhad had laid out at our CAC meeting, is just keeping the service that we have now that was adopted 20 years ago. Can anybody answer that?
Steve?
Well, so there's a couple of things we look at it as we're looking at these numbers. One is when the long range transit plan did this costing, did it take into account growth in cost? And one of our concerns looking at cost growth is post-pandemic, we've seen a significant increase in operating costs in transportation services. So how are those reflected in the projections? The other thing is, if we're looking at alternative forms of fuel, for instance, if we're committed to a carbon neutral footprint in electric buses, the cost of electric buses is far greater than that of the current CNG. So those are factors that have changed in the last 2-3 years. Are those costs incorporated? And then the other thing is, are we able to, and you said it yourself, we don't know who is going to ride and how much they're going to ride and where we're going to be successful. So when we look at a COA, what we're really doing is talking about how is there a reason for us to move resources from one place to another. So as you look at something like this, it's even more critical to build in flexibility to say, gee whiz, maybe what we wanted to do in express service didn't work, and we need to push some of those funds to weekend service where they're needed. So do we have the ability during the process to come back and revisit things based on changing situations and different facts that we've got? So I'll give you, for instance, I don't think the neighborhood circulator in the long range transit plan considered urban mobility, microtransit as mobility. The circulators were more suburban in nature. And if it didn't take into consideration the advantage of more urban stuff, then that might, that opens the debate about how much do we need in that category. So things change.
Well, I guess the question though was, okay, there are increased costs to doing the same service that we've been doing, that the RTA approved in 2006. And if you want to say that there's an additional cost for electric buses versus current buses, that's one thing. But my question is, how much of this budget that we're looking at is going to be providing the expanded service, because we have an overall number for express service that is going down. We've got a neighborhood circulator, and maybe that includes the micro whatever circulators, but the increased frequency on routes that aren't already the frequency. Like you saw the slide that talked about places like Broadway and Speedway and South 6 and Oracle that will continue to have 10 or 15 minute headways. But how much of this budget is actually providing that increased service that Pocky was laying out? We must know that. right?
Yeah, so just for the sake of comparing numbers, we're looking at 370 compared to 510, roughly 30%. Obviously, part of that 30% is going to be used to maintain existing services with the additional cost of doing business. So at the end of the day, it kind of goes back to what Steve was saying, that you have to have that flexibility and make those decisions during the 20-year life of the plan. Those adjustments have to be made along the way, and decisions have to be made that do you want to be able to accommodate more funding in one area versus the other area. So one of the things we've done, and we did that with the current plan, was to continue to work towards these as a upper cap per se. So far we've been able to, as you can see in the columns on the right hand side, we've been able to do what we need to do, and decisions are made on an annual basis. We have agreements that are updated on an annual basis. So the future boards have to make those decisions and have that flexibility, and they do. They are able to make those decisions as they move along, because these are set as caps, but the revenues that are coming into the RTA, that's up to the board to make those decisions and spend those dollars. So that's where that flexibility comes in.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but just one more comment. So the 30% that you're talking could all be spent on increased costs for current service. And so, and these improvements conceivably couldn't be made because we have a cap, but it could go down based on.
Yeah, so again, we want to be optimistic and hope that this inflation that we're experiencing and it is not going to sustain itself for too long. There needs to be some kind of a correction made along the way on cost of goods and services. But worst case scenario, you have that 30% to accommodate that additional cost of doing business.
Okay, current business. Okay, one last question. I'll let other people talk. So on page 38 of the long range transit plan, it talks about the improvement types of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then long term, which is the term of this plan, 20 years. From what it says to me is that above and beyond what we're spending for current services in order to, current dollars, I think, but to provide what they're recommending, that we need a 502 million additional dollars for 20 years, which is basically doubling the amount that we are looking at to divvy up right now. Am I reading that right?
You mentioned page 38.
Yeah, it's the improvement types in capital.
Yeah.
For all 20.
So these are separate improvements from what we were just talking about. These are the capital. This is the capital element of the long range transportation plan. Preston, what page was the service element? It's one element prior. There should be a table on one of the pages. I'll get you that page.
So I think it was what Arlen was talking about, but this, we would need capital money to be able to provide more frequency stops and station technologies, correct? So that should be included in what we're looking at?
That's correct.
Some of the elements include that capital expenditure that's needed. Obviously, some of them we may already have the fleet, but at some point during the 20 years, you have to replace those capital expenditures. So keep that in mind, that we're only talking about RTA source of funding here.
Yes.
We do have other sources of funds, federal, local. So those funds combined can meet that hopefully range of aspirational goals that we're looking for. So 510 just RTA dollars. And I think somebody else asked that question earlier. We're talking about 510 new RTA revenue. And by the time you add other funding sources, then hopefully we can put the puzzle together and meet some of those goals and objectives.
Okay, thank you.
I also wanted to note, I think this may be helpful, is on that, in that table you were referencing on page 38, there are some, rows to that table, like stops and stations, that I believe are covered under a different element within the RTA plan. So those, if I'm understanding it correctly, wouldn't be pulled from the 510 million that's specifically allocated for transit. There are those capital improvements that are it's going to be pulled from a different bucket within the RTA plan and not be deducted from that 510. So I wanted to mention that as well.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks for that. I got more digging to do. It'd be good to have those kind of numbers in front of us. And like Pocky said, read the long range transportation transit plan. So I did. Okay, thanks you guys.
Thanks, Carolyn. Okay, I've got John, Abby, and Eric, and then what I'd like to do is move on to our next agenda item where you can really dive in and hopefully bless these allocations and make a recommendation before 5. John.
Hi, good afternoon. Real quick, my name is John Zukas. I work with Steve Spade as Assistant General Manager for Sunlink Streetcar. Just real quick, I would echo what Steve, Farhad, and Carolyn said with regard to flexibility in the RTA's next plan. One of the things I've noticed is the transit sub-elements that are listed there did not include one of the elements, or doesn't appear, and I may have missed it, so my apologies, the streetcar. With that regard, again, I think Carolyn brought up a good question relevant to capital cost, and Farhad followed up with that regard, in that there's a different mix. There's different mixes in the region that are available, federal, local, and then certainly the RTA plans element. I guess what I would just mention is and advocate for is to please include the streetcar as a transit element in the RTA next, in that the long range transit plan, page 42, does ask the question, why aren't any streetcar purchases included? While I would not advocate for purchasing new streetcars, the 25 to 30-year lifespan does include mid-life rebuilds. Without those mid-life rebuilds, it's highly doubtful that those streetcars are going to last 25 to 30 years. So, certainly that I would ask that for consideration with regard to the CAC. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Abby?
Yeah, can folks hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you all. So the presentation of the goals has been really helpful. And I wanted to note particularly something that Farhad said, almost an hour ago at this point, which was that the feeling from these surveys and this information was that if there were more opportunities for people to use transit, they would. And that's been the impression I've been getting overall. That's very good. That's, I think, what we're all trying to do here. Given that, and also it's been great having you here, Steve, the reference for the need for us to be more flexible, that's actually built into our guiding principles. And I think in addition to what you mentioned about upgrades and electric buses and things like that, there is also the potential that Suntrans is going to remain fare free. I think there's a lot of momentum towards that. And to Diane's question, fare box recovery is a very small part of Suntrans revenue, but somebody else is going to have the numbers. Based on our desire to increase transit, the perception that the region is actually really interested in this, and the knowledge that we're going to need flexibility, I think that this bucket allocation of $510 million it's completely arbitrary. It's completely limiting to us. And I, for one, do not feel prepared to vote on any allocation within that. I think that it's backwards to say what we need first and not know how much it costs and just say, well, this is how much money we have. We'll see where that gets us. particularly given that it sounds like we're going to have more significant data and information within about a month. I would ask that we wait till we get the results of that Suntran survey and then see if we need to actually revisit how much money we have for public transportation in total within the CAC and the RTA Next plan before we vote on any allocations. That's it.
Sorry, Abby, I think we're losing you, but I think we got the gist of your question. Farhad, did you want to add to that?
Well, I'm not sure if that was a question or a comment, but again, as we've discussed, we believe the long-range plan is really a good starting point. As extensive of a high-level planning exercise that we've undertaken, I truly believe that really is a good roadmap. Really, the next question we all have to look at is, what can we do? How can we put a dent into the needs? And the needs are great. And given the fact that we're able to enhance above and beyond what we've already planned based on the right-hand column, looking at almost 30% over that. So those are the decisions we need to make. And again, the reality of it is limited funding sources, needs are great, and being able to hopefully move the ball and provide some level of understanding of, again, this is still a draft plan, right? So let's put those foundations together, put the blocks together, and then we can always make adjustments later. So that's part of the exercise, not making those decisions and waiting. It's really, in my opinion, doesn't help to put a puzzle together. So we got to start putting the pieces together, and that's really the intent.
Thank you. I've got
that since Bucky said I was cutting off.
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Abby.
I mean, Farhad, my concern about what you just said is that our
I'm sorry, Abby. It looks like you're going in and out, and we're having a hard time hearing you, at least to hear in the room.
And overall in the RTA Next, our funding sources was a, oh no, I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me now? All right.
Yes, now we can.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll try that again. Our funding sources aren't limited sort of by right. They were limited by design. We can put more money into the public transportation budget, and I think we need to. So I don't know if now is the right time to make a motion, but I'd like to move that we don't make any decisions on funding allocations on transit until we have more information on how much money these goals actually require.
We will be discussing that in the next agenda item, Abby. So I just want to get through a couple more questions so that we can move forward, and you can see all of the recommended allocations for this element. I've got Eric, is it Lato?
Yeah, Lato, thank you. I just wanted to comment on when Tom mentioned about the public wanting to know what they're getting for the investment. And I'm just really going to dovetail on a lot of the stuff Steve's already mentioned. But really, the COA process has two phases. You know, the first phase is, what do people want? And we will have that data next month to present to you all. And then the second piece is, and that's really the meat and potatoes component, is the draft recommendations. And that will be ready in June. So Steve, I'm sorry if you already mentioned that, but I just want to make that clear. We're going to have two really good buckets of information to bring forward from the COA. Again, A, what people want, and then B, our draft recommendations. So, and Abby, that was kind of where I was going with your point. So a lot of good data It's just not ready yet. So just, that's all I had. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Steve, did you have something to add to that?
Well, only that you've all shamed me into turning my camera on when I speak. So sorry I didn't do it sooner. I do think, I mean, I don't know what your time frame is in terms of how soon you need to make a decision on allocation, but I think everybody's got really good points, and that's that we do need flexibility built into the program long term, but also if we can in the next 30 to 60 days provide information that helps you make a better decision, then we'll really do our very best to bring you back some data that's really going to help you feel like kicking this decision down the road a little bit is going to really help you feel more comfortable in your decision making. And that's our goal.
Thank you, Steve. And then Mel, I just noticed I missed you, so I'm moving into the next agenda item, but please go ahead.
Thank you. It's been reinforced that what we've been given is based upon a concept of access. We haven't had any study that connects access to create riders or use. And so I asked to confirm where this has been used as a successful strategy. So among the particular questions, the last slide before showed we're reducing the express service, but almost doubling circulation. And I need to understand how many people we affecting with one versus the other, and why that's a smart decision. And then, unfortunately, among the questions is the one that was raised that our role is only to enhance. I don't know that that's accurate. And I certainly wouldn't expect that we continue to fund service that isn't very successful. So again, I'm not ready to vote for anything. On the last part, if I may, I understand the city has plans, and I haven't seen detail other than they're going to go from one place to the mall and one place to the airport. And again, I'm in favor of transit. I want it to work. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. So just to move forward to finish this presentation, the next item was going to be the review and discussion, which you've already had a lot of it. We just wanted to make sure you incorporated the long-range transit plan in your discussion previously. But now we want to just remind you of the transit element and potential sub-element allocations that we already showed you. So, mouse. Yeah.
I have a question why we're just going through this when it's clear we're not ready to make a decision. And as long as I can interrupt, on page 38, there's the intersection improvements at 200 intersections for the bus. And could somebody explain how that's going to work? Thank you.
So the intersection improvements in section 4 of the long-range transportation plan refer to a couple of different interventions, but those have the sub-element 2 of the plan, safety, addresses those needs specifically. They're not programmed into element 4 of the RTA Next plan.
Farhad?
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing, and I think Preston touched on it as well. So there are other elements of the RTA plan, including some of the corridor improvements, including some of the intersection safety improvements, that anytime a project is moving forward with any potential improvements, obviously they would look at the transit element along the corridor and the intersection, and those improvements can be implemented as part of those other elements of the RTA plan.
Okay, thank you, Farhad and Rio. So this section was just really to just remind you of the sub-elements. We wanted to just remind you that they're descriptive budget items for the purposes of the RTA Next plan. And then the board is our governing body, as you know, and over the life of the RTA Next plan, they'll implement transit sub-elements based on detailed studies of needs and updated information at the time of implementation. That's just to give you just a quick overall background on that. I never do it. So we apologize that the screen just changed on us, but we just wanted to remind you of the adopted sub-element allocations for maintenance and operation that this subcommittee had recommended was, you know, keeping weekend service at 10%, having weekday evening at 15%, express service at 5%, neighborhood circulator at 15%. They can't see this though.
Yeah, 15.
Frequency. I'm sorry, can you guys see the screen still?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
Yes.
you guys. Neighborhood circulator at 15%, frequency 17%, area expansion 7%, and then the special needs category at 31%. So here's the whole table of allocations. Hopefully you can see the whole thing. And on the left, again, is the $510 million adopted allocation. And then in the right is the $370.7 million. That's the current funding allocation through 2026. And this was the distribution based on that previous pie I just showed you for each of the sub-elements that we just went through. So the goal today was to you know, have you take the action of a possible recommendation to the full CAC. And that concludes the entire presentation. And I know we've had some suggestions, but I just wanted to make sure we completed the presentation to show you where we wanted to go with this today.
So Paki, I think somebody touched on the timeline. So the timeline, as you recall, RTA board's direction is to have a draft plan by July of 2023. The draft plan would have to include, obviously, all the sub-elements and the budget. So those adjustments that we keep talking about, adjustments will have to be made over the next several months to balance the budget. So it'll be a balanced budget, including all the sub-elements, identify obviously a line item for each budget, and then start developing really what we discussed earlier as a description of what each sub-element would include. So, for example, we talked about, the $51 million versus the $24 million. So that's where that description comes. So once a decision is made that $50 million is the right number, then we can follow up with our partners and provide that description for each sub-element. What would that $51 million would be invested in, and potentially even if you look at the current plan, we talk about the 4 periods of the 20-year plan, and we could even start developing which period what would be implemented. So that's one of the reasons it's important to really start getting the sub-elements, at least a foundation going, so we can work through that process of working with our partners to be able to define and describe what those investments would do for us. And again, subject to change, we can come back and make modifications along the way. With that,
Thank you,
Paki,
Farhan.
back to you.
Thank you. I've got Arlen and Carolyn.
Thanks. I get that the long-range transportation transit plan is a regional higher level plan overarching. A few questions here. Is everyone who provides transit in the valley of any form, is everybody singing from that same song sheet? Do the plans of the individual, like let's say Suntran or the Rural Valley Transit or whatever, are those all in sync with the long range transit plan to the extent they can be? Or are we operating, is everybody operating on a little different set of assumptions?
I would tell you, based on the process we followed and utilizing the team with Jared Walker, he was very, in my opinion, focused on doing exactly what you just described. Let's make sure we're all focusing on what is the long-term vision for the region. Where do we invest? What are the things that would most likely set us apart and make a difference in our system? Our system is already, in my opinion, and hopefully our providers that are here today can tell you that we have a great system. We just want to continue to do what we're doing and continue to enhance the system. So the perspective was, what else can we do to improve the service and serve the public in a way that everybody felt would be the best use of those funds. And as I mentioned earlier, and I think Paki mentioned it, very positive feedback from the public, positive feedback from all the providers. The plan was unanimously approved by regional council. So I believe it's definitely a good foundation, a vision to build on. And then that flexibility is the key. What else do we want to adjust? What else do we want to do and make sure we have a dynamic implementation over the next 20 years? So the plan by itself was a snapshot, but over the life of the 20-year plan, dynamically, what can we do to continue to make those adjustments and improve the services?
So that's good. And so the question then becomes, and I want to preface this by saying that I'm in agreement with other folks that spoke about, I'm supportive of transit, and I'm supportive of wanting to make all of this work and wanting to see real increases into the regional, and that by regional, I don't mean just RTA, but regional expenditures for transit. And such, even though I do have some disagreements within the plan, but I don't want to go into those now. Some of the assumptions, but given that, and given that the explanation that I'm hearing is that the RTA isn't the transit provider per se, it is adding supplemental monies to what others have already provided to try to maintain the system. I'm hearing though question as to whether or not the RTA monies will actually supplement to move us forward toward the plan, or whether the RTA monies, all or a portion of, maybe it's just a portion of, will supplant what local transit entities can't fund to maintain current status of the facilities from a capital and operating perspective. And if, well, let me ask that question and then I'll get to my third one. Are we talking about all or a portion of the monies of this increase going toward maintaining the current system as it more or less exists, or is all of the money going toward improving it toward the direction that the transit plan is recommending, or is none of it being used for that purpose?
So it might be important to differentiate between what we call the current investments, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all RTA dollars currently, what's shown in the right-hand column, have been investments from 2006 through 2026, and all of those have been enhancements.
Okay.
None of them were used to supplant any existing service. They all provided a new and enhanced service.
Got it.
So moving forward, we want to continue all those enhancements that have been implemented over the last 16 plus years. So there's a chunk of funding needed to do that. And then, as we discussed earlier, there's a chunk of money needed because of cost of doing business is increasing. So that's included in the new 30%. And then at the end of the day, and that's where we can really truly drill down and spell what would be new enhancement. And we can't do that until we start deciding where those allocations are. So that's when we can come back and say, if we decide to increase, let's look at the neighborhood circulator. If we go from 45.8 to 76.5, X amount of that would be new services. So we can actually spell that out for you. But currently, 45.8 was a brand new service over the 20 years of the current plan. And if the new plan doesn't budget for that, that service goes away. Okay. So if you want to maintain that service, at a minimum, we got to spend 45.8.
Okay. So from that perspective, then it's fair to say that all of the money, let's say in this $510 million column, and I'm not dividing it out any particular way right now, but all of that money is going toward paying for the current enhancements to the system, or new enhancements in the system in accordance with the transit plan that we saw.
Correct. The 510 will get us there.
Okay. And is there any language, and then my last question, is there any language in the nature of these RTA transit monies that I'm going to say this, that prohibit the usage of these monies, that let me put it in a positive way, that require that all of the monies be supplemental to existing expenditures of other local transit agencies and whoever else is funding, as opposed to supplanting those. Let's say one entity decides, I'm cutting, because of budget cuts, we're going to cut 25 million out of X, whatever X is in transit, and that the RTA dollars cannot be used to supplant that $25 million cut. It's just yes. for, and specifically for enhancements. Yes, I know that sounds like it's a very picky type of a thing, but I'll tell you the reason that I'm asking these questions is that after spending most of my life, or a lot of my life working with state land, where until things were changed, when we got to funding public education, the monies that were raised by the state land department for public education, which were supposed to enhance the expenditures from the legislature on public education, were actually being used to supplant so that they could have a lower tax great. And so they weren't adding any new money, in other words, so that's what I'm getting at. Is it written somewhere in the world that it says these are enhancements and we're not using it to supplement
Yes.
or supplant, excuse me, the existing expenditures?
Yes, RTA legislative language is very clear on not supplanting, and there's a specific provision on maintenance of effort. The maintenance of effort has been diligently tracked since day one of the RTA, and annually we have that increase in the maintenance of effort to make sure that we're not supplanting. So that's been done to date, and it will continue by law.
Okay, thanks, Farhad. Somebody had mentioned at one of the larger meetings that all of the money that would be provided in this would be going to basically maintain the status quo, and that to me is different than what was just said, and I appreciate that. I got clarification on this. Thank you.
No, thank you for asking that and that clarification. So again, the goal of RTA, even back in 2005-06, when we put the plan together, was to identify enhancements, and that's exactly what this next plan would do.
Thank you. I see John Hawbaker's hand up in case you wanted to address the regional comment earlier. John?
Yes, I just wanted to confirm what Fahad and some other folks had said, that we do feel in Laurel Valley that we're part of this, and we're supportive of it and in agreement with it. So hopefully with RTA next, we can reach that 510 million so we can enhance some things. But that being said, I just wanted to express that we do feel like we're part of this whole process.
Thank you so much, John. Carolyn.
Thank you. Hey, John, can you tell us who you are with? I don't know is identified.
Yes.
Town of Laurel Valley.
Yes, I'm with Town of Laurel Valley, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, sure.
Yeah, just one comment and then a suggestion moving forward. Well, a couple of comments as always. So somebody had asked about the decrease in express service and if that, who's getting left out. I will bring up what I brought up a few times is that, rapid transit and streetcar BRT could easily supplant that in our plan. But we need to hear from the city of Tucson about what their plans are. And I will say, Farhad, as far as the region, the PAG adopting the 2020 plan, I think that the city was still working on their public process and their move Tucson. That I think there's people on here from the city of Tucson, you can correct me, and that wasn't until 2021. So it would be good to hear from them. And in the last plan on the ballot was $533 million for transit, and that included like almost 90 million for the streetcar. So that's not included here, but so that would have been, I think, 443, and that was in 2006 dollars. So the 510 million isn't really more. It just really depends on the revenue in the next few years, whether it goes up or down or never stays the same. But I guess one is I agree with Abby. I don't think there's a lot of information, including the big one with the city of Tucson and what their proposals are with or without any kind of rapid transit, just if this still dovetails with what they found out from their public process and Move Tucson. And so I think we should wait on some other information, and hopefully, Farhad, you can get us what's in the long-range transportation plan for the transit portions that you expect to be coming in from other sources, I'm sure mainly federal. But is there anybody here from the city of Tucson that can tell us if they might be able to give us a presentation on what they will be looking at in transit. Hopefully this works for them, or there's some things that won't be included that we need to look at. Thanks.
I do see Rhett's hand up. Rhett? Rhett Cronenshield. You're muted if you're trying to talk. And well, Arlen, your hand's still up. Did you mean to have it up?
No,
Okay.
that's, oops, sorry, I just took it down.
Okay, thanks.
So while you're
Farhad?
while you're waiting on that, just a couple responses to Carolyn there. So as you recall, the whole process was named projects versus buckets, right? So these are just buckets, regardless of what you do with named projects. So we can always continue that conversation about named projects. But the buckets, obviously, as you mentioned, previously, there was roughly about $430 million for these same buckets, and now we're looking at 510. So there is that small increase that we talked about. If you look at the long range plan, even the long range plan was somewhat, I think, not clear on what potential future named projects we may want to consider. So they did put a lot of emphasis on future studies needed, future analysis needed. So they were somewhat silent on potential future projects, but that's the ongoing discussion we need to have. But again, I think that's separate from the buckets, right? So if it's a named project, it's a named project, and we address it separately.
Thanks, Farhad. I've got Robin and Tom.
Right, as far as Move Tucson, Carolyn, we'd be happy to give you guys a presentation on Move Tucson and what it included. The one thing that I will say is that Move Tucson did not include a set of funding sources. It just got the public input as to what the public wanted. There is a website still that will tell you some of that information, but we'd be happy to give you a presentation on Move Tucson and aim it towards what the opinions of the public were for transit. I think.
Thank you. And just a follow-up question then, Robin. Is the city council going to be at any time in the near future going to be talking about how much city funding might go in to the plan above and beyond what they have now, or is that far in the future?
Well, as far as Move Tucson is concerned, part of what the city council has already done is brought forward the Proposition 411 to the voters, which they did pass, and that includes some level of pavement repair and then the safety effort, but it did not include a piece for transit at this time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Tom, and then Steve.
Thanks, Pucky. I think we've gotten into kind of a chicken and egg situation here as a committee. I hear that we're really wanting to make a final decision, but feel we have more information needed. Farhad has talked to us about that information that's needed. So, maybe a path forward at this point is to continue with what we adopted as a subcommittee back in 2020, send that to the jurisdictions, perhaps through the TMC or perhaps just directly to those agencies, and get that feedback that Farhad has talked about, where we find out what they can do with that money and what it will give them, and as far as enhancements, whether it covers the current enhancements or the status quo, and how much more it will do. But without that information, I think it's really hard for us to say, we should change the bus frequency from 86.7 to 92 million. I don't see us changing any of these at this point unless we have that kind of solid feedback and kind of assessment of the metrics by those jurisdictions. And if we just keep having these subcommittee meetings to learn more about what the status quo is and all those things, we're still a ways away from knowing whether we support that level of investment in each of these sub-elements. So, my suggestion is that we move forward with this as it has previously been adopted, and get that feedback so that we can start that iterative process that we have had to do with the named projects as well as for each of the sub elements. But I don't think we move the ball forward by continuing to try to figure out better numbers than we already have here. And we know we have to start with the 510 million because that's what the board has directed us. And without having all that feedback from the agencies, I don't see how we're able to say that 510 should be 710 or 610 or 410. So that's what I suggest that we do.
Farhad?
Good suggestion. Thank you, Tom. We'll do that as we've discussed before. The transit working group members were involved last time around. They're involved this time around. It's interesting, and especially when we talk about transit, the needs are great. Everybody will agree that we can easily come back and tell you what can be spent on what, and maybe that's the next logical step. But the entire 510 will be consumed. Everybody hopefully at the table will agree that it'll be spent hopefully in a most efficient and beneficial way. So that's not our challenge. Our challenge is if everybody's okay with these numbers, we'll go to work and ask for that. And so it's an assignment. It'll take time, and folks are going to potentially say, well, we don't know. We're going to have to make some assumptions, but that's fine. Let's make some assumptions and answer those questions. So yeah, I like your suggestion. We'll move in that fashion. Again, a lot of the transit working group members are on call right now. If somebody thinks that might be too much of an effort, let us know now. Otherwise, we'll follow up with you and ask you to help us answer that question.
Yeah. Additionally, in the meantime, we still need to look at those two named projects, the high capacity transit projects that have been passed by the CAC over to this subcommittee to discuss and recommend about.
Exactly.
And as well as what was brought up today about the city saying that the streetcar is not included and needs to be. So I think those are a couple of issues that the subcommittee can still work on. But I like the idea that we can get back really solid information from everyone. As Farhad just said.
Yeah, again, I appreciate the working group folks being on call, and again, let us know now because
Yeah, I'm not okay with this. This is Abby, and I think that you just took a vote for us.
No.
I'm not okay with this, and I think we need a vote because I don't get the perception that everybody on this committee is okay with taking these numbers and deciding that we're going forward with this. I'm really concerned. I think we need a vote if that's what we think we're doing today.
You misunderstood what I wanted to do.
Yeah, we're not talking about a vote. We're talking about asking the transit working group folks to help answer the question and define what we can do with the allegations that we currently have in front of us.
No, you're asking for approval subject to. And, and we've heard no more new information. I understand the transit plan has been there, but we haven't received any new information to look at anything differently, and I'm not ready to approve this.
That's not what we're asking for. We're asking the transit working group members, who are the transit providers, to help us answer that question.
And Steve Spade, I saw that your hand was up earlier. I don't know if you still wanted to add something or if you had to leave.
Originally, I was going to say that Rhett texted me that his mic didn't work and that he was going to follow up on Robin's comment that we could give an update on the high capacity transit plans, but I think Tom asked that question already. So anyhow.
All right, well, thank you for that. Again, I think that's probably the best next step in the process, to be able to get the transit working group to help us with that response. So we'll plan on doing that and schedule another meeting. So hopefully they'll be able to lay that out for you.
Carolyn?
Really clear that we did not, this committee did not approve this budget amount. We want more information. Right. We're not approving this. We're not suggesting to the CAC at large that these are the allocations or the divisions. I want that to be really clear on the record.
For the record, this allocation was approved by this subcommittee previously, so that's...
Then why are you asking us to approve it again today? Why has this come up multiple times?
The discussion was that let's move it forward to the full CAC to include it in a draft plan. And based on today's conversation, we want additional clarification on what each allocation would do before we do that.
This is Carolyn. Could you restate what you were asking us to do, Tom? Because it's almost like semantics. I think that many of us aren't ready to move this number forward and be included in the plan, because whether we're voting or not, that's what it sounds like. So I'm a little confused. I would say that we don't move the number ahead until we get that information. And I think that's what Abby's saying, and I think that's what Mel is saying. And I don't know how other people think, but moving it forward is kind of like, assuming that we approve something. I think that's where the confusion is.
Yeah, that's what I thought I said. This committee won't, I think, be able to ratify, adopt, or modify the allocation from 2020 without that input. So I'm not asking for any action from the subcommittee today. I'm asking for information from the providers, as we've talked about. It doesn't, I mean, it already exists in the draft, the draft ballot that Farhad prepared recently. I'm saying we're not able at this time to say whether that overall number looks right to us or if the individual sub allocations look right until we get back information from them.
Okay, would it be helpful for me to make a motion that to include in for moving forward twice as much money for transit at this point, and then work down from there like we are doing with the corridor projects? I mean, I don't know, because it sounds like kind of, at least Farhad was saying, we're moving ahead to the full committee with this number.
No, we're not. No, let me make sure we're clear.
Okay.
Tom's recommendation was to ask the transit providers to help us answer the question, what could they do with the 510. And we'll reach out to the transit providers, ask them to help us identify how much of the 510 is to continue the existing enhancements that have been implemented by the RTA, how much of it is going to be cost of doing business and an increase in cost, and how much of it is going to be new enhancements. So to answer that question, we need a number to begin with, and these are the numbers that we can use to answer that question. We are not taking anything to the full CAC. We're coming back to this subcommittee to answer that question.
Got it. Thank you.
I don't think that we were saying that we want to ask the transit providers what they can do with the 510. I want to know how much they actually need to do these services. As far as I'm concerned, this 510 number is arbitrary and we might have to revisit it. So I'm more interested in how much do these actual suggested expansions that we've discussed here, that this RTA says they got public input for, how much do those actually cost? Not what can you do with 510. It's not how we did the roadway elements. We got the actual estimates for the actual projects first and then went from there, not telling them, hey, this much money is how much we got, figure it out. So I am really interested in getting the information from the transit providers, but I don't want to start with, hey, we've got 510, what can you do with it? I want it to be, how much does this cost? Get back to us. And that way we as the CAC can go back as a subcommittee, we can go back to the main CAC, and then as the CAC, we go to the other boards and say, hey, you know what, we looked at this, 510 is inadequate. We need more, please give us more. So I want that to be clear again. I want that to be what gets back to the CAC at large. I think that's what other folks are saying. People can correct me if I'm wrong.
Amanda?
I just want to make sure I'm sharing this. I know people keep saying it, but I want to echo that I also was feeling the same way that Abby, Caroline, and I believe it was Alvin was saying. I was feeling like we were being told this is what was being proposed and we're asking them to vote. And like Abby has just said, I don't feel comfortable telling the transit providers that here you have it's 510. I want to hear what they need so we have a better understanding of how we need to be distributing this funds. Because one thing that we keep forgetting, we keep talking about the cost of business has gone up, but we haven't really talked about COVID has changed things and has changed the way that services are being currently provided, and they're not being provided at the level that they were before when this first plan was implemented. And we need to take that in consideration going forward. Where are we right now? And where do we need to be to get back where we were, and then also improve and enhance things?
Thank you, Amanda. Arlen?
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow up, as Farhad was summarizing, that he made three important points relative to the amount of money, the 510 adopted allocation, and I won't reiterate them, but so that we understand from their perspective how that would be utilized. But I also think, and so I think that's good, and that needs to be included in the request to the providers for that information. But secondarily, I also think that if they had their druthers, what is a reasonable amount that they would actually need to provide what services that they need to be providing at this point in the game, in accordance with the long range transit plan. Not necessarily going for pie in the sky everything, which will be an impossible number and is not something that the RTA is able to do. But is this a reasonable number? And if not, what is a reasonable number to assist in these areas? So I just, that's my perspective, and that's what I think we're asking, or we should be asking the providers for that information. And to be honest with you, I actually thought we were asking for this last time too. but was kind of surprised when we didn't have some of that this time. So this time we're really asking for that information before we move forward, I think. Thank you.
Well said, well said. Thanks, Arlen.
Amanda, your hand is still up. I don't know if you had a follow-up. Oh, no, it's down. Then let's see. Okay. I think that's all of the hands I see, except Arlen needs to put it back down. Farhad, did you have a follow-up?
No, I just want to thank everybody, and I think we're moving in the right direction. And again, I want to thank all the transit providers to be on call, and hopefully they heard the same thing, that the exercise is definitely something that we're going to follow up with them, and hopefully they're prepared to help us with it. So thank you all.
Yeah, Paki, I wanted to echo what Farhad said. We really appreciate having the providers present and active in our deliberations. It's so helpful, and particularly for them to hear kind of the flavor of our somewhat amateur debate about some of these things, and to help guide us through it without laughing at me. So,
yeah,
thanks.
Agreed.
Yes, I did want to thank the transit working group members for being flexible and attending these meetings, and for the transit operators as well. We appreciate your input and also your ear, and as you can see, your advice will be much appreciated as we move forward. So it is 8 minutes after 5, and if there are no more questions, I think I will go ahead and move to adjourn this meeting.
Thanks, Paki.